Vanessa's laughter echoed across the ballroom the moment she looked at my dress. $18, she said
Darling, that
loudly,
navy
holding
dress
her
is so
champagne
cheap.
glass.
Did you find it at a yard sale?
That's
How
actually
embarrassing for you.
embarrassing. A few people laughed with her. I felt every eye in the room slide over my wrinkled navy dress, the one I had stayed up all night fixing by hand, because it was the only decent thing I could afford. My son Michael stood beside me and said nothing. My throat tightened. I picked up my purse and turned toward the exit before anyone could see the tears in my eyes. Then suddenly, the entire room went silent. The CEO of Whitmore Capital, Charles Whitmore himself, walked straight toward me and wrapped his arms around me like family. Before we continue, I want to ask you something honestly. Have you ever been judged for the way you looked dressed or lived by the very people who should have loved you most? If this story touched your heart already, please like and subscribe to the channel. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your city right now. I always love reading your stories and hearing your voices. I live in a small, one-story house on the west side of San Antonio, Texas. The paint around the windows has started peeling, and the porch creaks every time someone steps on it. Most people drive past homes like mine without even noticing them. But to me, that little house holds 40 years of memories. Every morning, I wake up at 5:30 out of habit, even though nobody needs breakfast packed anymore. I make myself coffee in the same chipped ceramic mug my husband Thomas bought me at a flea market 32 years ago. The words, "World's Best Mama," are almost faded away now. Sometimes I trace the letters with my thumb while the house sits in silence around me. Silence becomes louder when you get older, especially after losing the person who filled the rooms with life. Thomas died 9 years ago from heart failure. One moment, he was sitting in his favorite chair watching baseball, and the next moment, my entire world was collapsing inside an ambulance. After the funeral, people kept telling me the same thing. "You still have Michael." And I did. My son was my pride, my purpose, the reason Thomas and I had worked ourselves half to death all those years. Thomas spent 30 years pouring concrete under the brutal Texas heat. His knees gave out before he turned 60. His back never recovered from the construction accidents he ignored because we needed the overtime pay. As for me, I worked wherever I could, cleaning motel rooms, mending uniforms, altering wedding dresses, sewing hems until my fingers bled. I used to sit at the kitchen table until 2 in the morning with the sewing machine rattling beside me while little Michael slept on the couch because he wanted to stay close to me. Sometimes I would look at him sleeping there with his math books on his chest and whisper to myself, "He's going to have a better life." That dream kept me alive during years when we barely had enough groceries in the refrigerator. There were nights Thomas and I pretended we had already eaten dinner so Michael could have seconds. We thought he never noticed. Children always notice. Michael was brilliant from the beginning. Teachers adored him. He earned scholarships, awards, opportunities we never could have imagined when we were young. The day he got accepted into a top MBA program, Thomas cried harder than I had ever seen. He held Michael's acceptance letter in shaking hands and kept saying, "Our boy made it." But success changes people slowly. Not all at once. At first, Michael still called every night from college, then every weekend, then once every couple of weeks. Eventually, our conversations became rushed and polite, like he was speaking to a distant relative instead of his mother. "I'm busy, Mom. I'll call you later. Things are crazy at work." Those words became familiar. Then Vanessa entered his life. The first time I met her, she wore a cream-colored pantsuit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. She smiled politely, but there was something cold behind her eyes. Like she had already measured my worth the second she saw my house. She hugged me carefully as if poverty might rub off on her skin. At dinner, she kept asking questions that sounded kind, but weren't. "So Michael grew up here. You actually sewed all these curtains yourself. This neighborhood must have changed a lot over the years." I knew what she really meant. How did someone like you raise someone like him? But Michael looked happy, so I swallowed the discomfort. That's what mothers do. We swallow pain so our children can keep smiling. After they got married, things became worse without Michael even realizing it. Vanessa hated when I visited unexpectedly. She hated my old-fashioned clothes. She hated my accent when I spoke Spanish too quickly. Once during Thanksgiving dinner at their house in Dallas, I overheard her whispering to one of her friends in the kitchen. "Michael's mother is sweet," she said softly. "But honestly, she's a little rough around the edges." They laughed quietly. I pretended not to hear it. Because when you love someone deeply, you learn how to survive small humiliations. Still, no matter how distant Michael became, I never stopped being proud of him. Every month, I met my friend Rosa for coffee at a little bakery downtown. And every month, I showed her new photos of Michael. Michael at conferences. Michael shaking hands with executives. Michael standing beside luxury cars. He works so hard, I would tell her with a smile. And I meant it every single time. Even if he barely called anymore. Even if birthdays became text messages instead of visits. Even if I sometimes stared at my silent phone for hours, wondering whether I should call first again. One rainy Thursday afternoon, I was hemming a blue bridesmaid dress for a customer when I heard the mail slot clang open. I wiped my hands on my apron and walked slowly to the front door. Among the bills and grocery coupons was a cream-colored envelope with elegant handwriting. New York return address. My chest tightened immediately. I carried it carefully to the kitchen table before opening it. Inside was a short, handwritten note. "Dear Abigail, I hope you are well. I still think about your kindness more often than you know. I may finally have the chance to repay a small part of what I owe you. I hope to see you soon. C.W." I stared at those initials for a long time. Then I folded the letter neatly and placed it inside the wooden drawer beside several others just like it. I never told Michael about the letters. I never told anyone. Some stories feel too sacred to explain, too important to place in careless hands. That evening, I stood at the kitchen sink washing dishes while the Texas sunset painted orange light across the room. And for the first time in months, my phone rang. "Michael." A small smile appeared on my face before I even answered. "Hi, sweetheart." There was a pause on the other end. Then he cleared his throat. "Mom, there's a company gala next weekend. Vanessa and I were thinking maybe you could come." My heart lifted so quickly, it almost hurt. For a moment, I honestly thought I had imagined Michael's phone call. After we hung up that evening, I stood alone in my kitchen, holding the phone against my chest while tears filled my eyes. It had been so long since my son had invited me anywhere important. Not out of obligation. Not for a quick holiday dinner. Not because someone else insisted. He wanted me there. Or at least, that was what I told myself. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I opened my closet and stared at the small row of dresses hanging inside. Most of them were old church dresses or outfits I wore to funerals and community events. Nothing looked appropriate for a corporate gala filled with wealthy executives. I touched each hanger carefully anyway. A mother never wants to embarrass her child, especially not a child she sacrificed everything for. 3 days later, I took the bus downtown to a discount department store near the highway. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead while teenagers wandered through racks of clearance clothing without paying attention to anything around them. I spent nearly an hour pretending to browse calmly while secretly checking every price tag twice. Finally, near the back of the store, I found it. A simple, navy blue dress. Long sleeves, soft fabric. Elegant in a quiet way. The tag read, $18. I held it against myself in the mirror. It wasn't glamorous, but it looked dignified. And dignity matters when you reach my age. I bought the dress and carried it home folded carefully in tissue paper, like it was something precious. That evening, I spread it across my kitchen table beneath the warm, yellow light hanging overhead. One sleeve needed stitching. The hemline was uneven. A loose thread hung near the zipper. Most people would never notice those flaws. But years of sewing had trained my eyes too well. So I threaded my needle and began fixing every detail by hand. As I worked, memories drifted through my mind the way they always do when my hands are busy. I remembered sewing Michael's Halloween costumes when we couldn't afford store-bought ones. I remembered patching holes in his jeans late at night before school. I remembered making Thomas a tie from leftover fabric because we couldn't buy him one for a wedding. Back then, we had very little money, but we still had pride and love. That matters more than people think. Around 10 that night, my phone buzzed. Michael. I smiled instantly and answered. Hi, sweetheart. His voice sounded distracted. Hey, Mom. Just checking if you got the invitation email. Yes, I said warmly. Thank you for inviting me. A short silence followed. Then he cleared his throat. Listen. This gala is kind of a big deal. I know. There'll be investors there, senior partners, a lot of important people. Something in his tone made my stomach tighten. I understand Michael, and Vanessa's been stressed planning everything, he continued quickly. So just don't take anything personally if she seems overwhelmed. I lowered my eyes to the dress lying across my lap. Oh, I said softly. Of course. Another pause. Then he said something that hurt more than I expected. Maybe keep things simple, okay? Simple? I knew exactly what he meant. Don't talk too much. Don't act too comfortable. Don't remind people where I came from. But I swallowed the pain before it could reach my voice. I'll behave myself, I said gently. Michael laughed awkwardly. That's not what I meant. But it was. After we hung up, I sat quietly for a long time. Then I picked up the dress again and continued sewing. Because mothers forgive little wounds too easily, the following afternoon, I took out my small jewelry box from the bedroom drawer. Inside sat the pearl earrings Thomas had given me on our 20th anniversary. They weren't real pearls. We both knew that, but Thomas had saved money for months to buy them. You deserve beautiful things too, he had whispered while fastening them onto my ears. I held the earrings in my palm now and smiled sadly. Help me look respectable, Tommy, I whispered into the empty room. By Friday, the dress was finished. I hung it carefully against the closet door and stepped back to admire it. It still looked inexpensive, but it looked clean, graceful, loved. And somehow, that mattered to me. Saturday morning, Vanessa called unexpectedly. I nearly dropped my coffee reaching for the phone. Hello, Abigail. Her voice sounded unusually sweet. Too sweet. Yes, dear. I just wanted to remind you the gala starts at 7 sharp. Don't be late. I won't. And one more thing, she added lightly. The event is very formal. I understand. We're trying to maintain a certain image. There it was, the real message beneath the polite tone. I gripped the phone tighter. I'll do my best, I said quietly. Vanessa laughed softly. I'm sure you will. The moment the call ended, a strange heaviness settled inside my chest. Not fear exactly, more like warning. Still, I refused to let negativity ruin this opportunity. For the rest of the weekend, I focused on hopeful thoughts instead. Maybe Michael truly wanted me there. Maybe things were finally changing. Maybe this gala could heal some of the distance growing between us. Sunday evening, my friend Rosa stopped by with sweet bread from the bakery. When she saw the dress hanging nearby, her eyes widened. "Oh, Abigail, you look beautiful." I laughed softly. Beautiful isn't the word I'd use. "Yes, it is." She walked closer and touched the sleeve gently. "You fixed this yourself, of course. You always make things look richer than they are." Her words stayed with me after she left, because that had always been my life. Making something beautiful out of almost nothing. Late that night, unable to sleep, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, wearing the dress for the first time. I adjusted the earrings, smoothed the fabric over my waist, turned slowly from side to side. An old woman stared back at me, gray streaks in her dark hair, lines around tired eyes, hands shaped by decades of hard work. But there was something else too. Strength, the kind women earn quietly. I thought about Michael as a little boy reaching for my hand on his first day of school. I thought about Thomas smiling proudly at graduation ceremonies. I thought about all the years we survived together, and suddenly, I realized something painful. I wasn't nervous about wealthy strangers judging me. I was terrified my own son already did. The next morning, while folding laundry in the living room, I heard my phone buzz again. "Unknown number." I answered cautiously. "Hello." A calm male voice replied immediately. "Mrs. Hernandez, yes. This is Jonathan Reed, executive assistant to Mr. Charles Whitmore." My heart stopped. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "Who?" "Mr. Whitmore asked me to confirm whether you'll be attending the gala next Saturday." I slowly sat down on the couch. How did he know I was invited? There was a brief silence. Then the assistant answered carefully. "Ma'am, Mr. Whitmore has been hoping to see you again for a very long time. The gala was held at the Grand Meridian Hotel in downtown Dallas. I had never seen anything so extravagant in my life. The building itself looked like a palace made of glass and gold. Valets in black uniforms opened car doors beneath enormous crystal chandeliers hanging outside the entrance. Women stepped out wearing designer gowns and diamonds that sparkled brighter than the city lights. And there I was, clutching my old brown purse with nervous hands, wearing an $18 dress. For several seconds, I remained frozen near the sidewalk, while luxury cars pulled up behind me one after another. I suddenly became painfully aware of every wrinkle in my clothes, every gray strand in my hair. I almost told the taxi driver to take me home. But then I remembered Michael's voice inviting me. "Mom, maybe you could come." Maybe? Not exactly warm, but enough to keep me standing there. I took a deep breath, thanked the driver, and slowly walked toward the entrance. Inside, the lobby smelled like expensive perfume and polished marble. Soft piano music floated through the air, while elegantly dressed guests laughed beside towering flower arrangements. Everything looked flawless, including everyone except me. I spotted Michael almost immediately near the ballroom entrance. He wore a tailored black tuxedo that probably cost more than my monthly income. For one brief moment, pride filled my chest so strongly, it nearly erased my anxiety. That was my little boy, my Michael, the child who used to run barefoot through sprinklers in our tiny yard. Now he looked like he belonged on magazine covers. When he finally noticed me approaching, his smile appeared a little too slowly. "Mom," he said, kissing my cheek quickly. "You made it." "You look handsome," I whispered. "Thanks." His eyes flickered briefly toward my dress. Not admiration. evaluation. I noticed the hesitation before he forced another smile. You look nice. Nice. The kind word people use when they don't mean beautiful. Before I could answer, Vanessa appeared beside him wearing a silver gown that hugged her perfectly. Diamonds glittered around her neck beneath the ballroom lights. She looked like the kind of woman who had never worried about grocery prices a single day in her life. Abigail, she said brightly. Too brightly. You came. I smiled politely. Of course. Her eyes moved slowly over my dress. I watched her notice the inexpensive fabric, the hand-stitched sleeve, the old shoes. Something smug flashed across her face before disappearing beneath another polished smile. Well, she said lightly, I suppose simple elegance never goes out of style. I knew an insult when I heard one, but years of surviving difficult people had taught me how to pretend otherwise. Thank you, I replied gently. Vanessa looped her arm through Michael's immediately. We should introduce her to a few people, she whispered to him, though not quietly enough. Michael nodded awkwardly, and just like that, I became a social obligation. Vanessa guided me through clusters of wealthy guests while introducing me with the same uncomfortable smile every time. This is Michael's mother. Not Abigail, not Mrs. Hernandez, just Michael's mother. An attachment, a footnote. Some people shook my hand politely. Others barely glanced at me before returning to conversations about investments, vacation homes, and private schools. At one point, a woman wearing emerald earrings asked where I lived. San Antonio, I answered warmly. Oh, she said. That single word carried an entire judgment inside it. Another man asked whether I had retired. I still do sewing work from home sometimes, I explained. His smile tightened instantly. You could almost see people mentally placing me into a lower category the moment they heard the word sewing. Funny how quickly wealth decides who deserves respect. Eventually, Michael drifted away to speak with executives near the bar. Vanessa followed him, and suddenly, I found myself standing alone beside a giant arrangement of white roses while hundreds of strangers moved around me like I was invisible. I reached for a glass of water from a passing tray, mostly to keep my hands occupied. That was when I noticed several people staring at me. Not mockingly, curiously. An older gentleman near the ballroom entrance narrowed his eyes, as if trying to remember something. Another gray-haired woman whispered quietly to her husband while glancing in my direction. At first, I assumed they were judging my appearance too. But then something strange happened. One of the hotel staff approached me carefully. He looked to be around 65, wearing a crisp black service uniform and silver-rimmed glasses. The moment he stopped in front of me, his entire expression changed. Recognition? Mrs. Hernandez, he asked softly. I blinked in surprise. Yes. His eyes widened immediately. Oh my goodness, he whispered. I knew it was you. I stared at him confused. I'm sorry. Do we know each other? The man smiled warmly. No, ma'am, but I've seen your photograph before. A chill ran through my body. Photograph before he could answer, another server called his name from across the room. He glanced back reluctantly. I apologize, he said quickly. It's just, Mr. Whitmore speaks very highly of you. My heartbeat stopped for half a second. Charles Whitmore. Even hearing the name made old memories stir inside me. The man smiled again respectfully before hurrying away. I stood completely still after he left, because now I could feel it. Something strange was happening tonight. Something bigger than I understood. Mom? I turned to find Michael approaching again, though this time he looked tense. Everything okay? He asked quietly. Yes, I answered slowly. I studied his face carefully. You never told me Mr. Whitmore would be here tonight. Michael looked confused. He owns the company. Of course he's here. I forced a small smile. Right, of course. But my chest had already tightened with nervousness. I hadn't seen Charles Whitmore in over 3 decades. Not since the night Thomas and I sat across from him in our tiny kitchen while he admitted he was completely broke. Back then, he had looked exhausted, desperate. Now, he was one of the most powerful businessmen in America. Life changes people in ways that feel impossible until you witness them yourself. Mom, Michael said suddenly, lowering his voice, "Just try to relax tonight. Okay? I am relaxed. You just seem a little overwhelmed." I almost laughed at that. Overwhelmed, I was standing inside a world built for people who had spent their entire lives being told they mattered. People like me usually entered through service doors. Still, I nodded politely. "I'm fine, sweetheart." Michael gave another distracted smile before glancing over my shoulder toward a group of executives waving him over. "I need to go handle something. Vanessa will stay with you." But Vanessa didn't stay with me. The second Michael walked away, she leaned closer and murmured softly, "Try not to look so nervous, Abigail. People can sense insecurity." Then she walked off before I could respond. I stood there alone again, humiliated, small, invisible. For the first time all evening, I suddenly wished I had never come. I reached into my purse and touched the folded handkerchief Thomas used to carry. That tiny gesture always calmed me. But before I could gather myself completely, I heard nearby laughter growing louder behind me. Vanessa's voice. And somehow, I already knew that laughter was about to become my nightmare. Vanessa's laughter floated across the ballroom like shattered glass. Sharp, cold, impossible to ignore. At first, I tried pretending it had nothing to do with me. I kept my eyes lowered and sipped my water quietly, while guests continued moving around us beneath the golden chandeliers. But then I heard my name. "Well, Abigail," Vanessa said, loudly smiling at the small crowd surrounding her. "You never told us where you bought your dress." Several women turned toward me immediately. I froze. Vanessa tilted her champagne glass casually, her eyes glittering with amusement. "It's vintage, right?" she continued. "Or maybe custom-made." The women beside her laughed softly. I understood exactly what was happening. This wasn't curiosity, it was performance. And I was the punchline. Michael stood nearby speaking with 2 executives. I waited for him to notice the tension gathering around us. He didn't. Or maybe he chose not to. I forced a polite smile. "Oh, it's nothing special." Vanessa stepped closer. "No, tell us," she insisted sweetly. "I'm dying to know." Something inside me whispered to stay quiet. But I had spent my entire life telling the truth, even when it embarrassed me. So I answered honestly. "It was on clearance," I said softly. $18. The silence lasted less than 1 second before Vanessa burst into laughter. Real laughter, loud enough to turn heads across the ballroom. $18, she repeated, nearly choking on amusement. Several people around her laughed too. One man covered his mouth to hide his smile. Another woman glanced openly at my dress with pity. Vanessa shook her head dramatically. "Oh my God," she said. "That explains everything." More laughter. I felt heat rush into my face so quickly, I thought I might faint. Every insecurity I had carried into that ballroom suddenly wrapped around my throat. The cheap fabric, the old shoes, the careful stitching I had done by hand. In one cruel moment, all my effort became a joke. I looked toward Michael instinctively. "Please, just say something, anything." For a brief second, our eyes met across the crowd. I saw embarrassment flash across his face. Not embarrassment for me. Embarrassment because of me. He walked over quickly, lowering his voice. "Vanessa," he muttered. "Come on." But he was smiling awkwardly too, like he wanted the moment to pass without discomfort. Vanessa touched his arm dramatically. "I'm sorry," she laughed. "I didn't realize we were doing bargain fashion tonight." Several guests chuckled again. Michael rubbed the back of his neck before looking at me. "Mom," he said quietly, "maybe don't talk about prices like that." That sentence hurt more than all the laughter combined, because suddenly I understood something terrible. My son wasn't ashamed of their behavior. He was ashamed of me. I stared at him in disbelief. This was the little boy who once wore thrift store sneakers to school because I couldn't afford better ones. The little boy who cried tears of joy when I surprised him with a second-hand bicycle one Christmas. Back then, we had been poor together. Now he acted like poverty belonged only to me. The ballroom noise blurred around me. I could barely breathe. Vanessa noticed the pain on my face and smiled slightly before taking another sip of champagne. "I just think appearances matter at events like this," she said casually to the group. "Especially when you represent someone important." Represent someone important. As if I were some stain threatening Michael's polished image. I tightened my grip on my purse beneath the table. Inside was Thomas's old handkerchief folded neatly after all these years. I touched it gently, and suddenly, I remembered another night long ago. Thomas sitting beside me at our kitchen table after a wealthy customer insulted my handmade clothing. "You listen to me?" he had said firmly while holding my face in his rough workman's hands. There's nothing shameful about honest struggle. I almost heard his voice beside me now, but the memory only made the ache worse. One of the women near Vanessa leaned closer and whispered loudly enough for me to hear. She actually admitted the price. Vanessa laughed again. "That's the best part." Something inside my chest cracked quietly. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just enough to change something forever. I looked at Michael one last time. He avoided my eyes. That was when I realized I was completely alone in that room. A waiter passed carrying silver trays of champagne, and the glittering ballroom suddenly felt suffocating. Everyone looked beautiful, expensive, confident, and I felt like a poor old woman pretending to belong somewhere she never should have entered. I slowly rose from my chair. Vanessa noticed immediately. "Oh no," she said with fake concern. "You're not upset, are you?" I forced my trembling hands to stay still. "No," I whispered. "I think I'm just tired." Michael finally looked at me properly then. "You're leaving." His tone sounded inconvenienced more than concerned. I nodded softly. "It's a long drive back to San Antonio." Vanessa shrugged lightly. "Well, thank you for coming." "Thank you for coming." Like I had attended a business meeting instead of my own son's important night. I picked up my purse, carefully praying my tears wouldn't fall until I reached the parking lot. As I turned toward the ballroom exit, snippets of whispered conversation followed behind me. $18. "Did you see the shoes? She's Michael's mother." Each word landed like another cut. Near the entrance, I stopped briefly to steady myself beside one of the marble columns. My chest hurt. Not because strangers had laughed at me. Strangers don't truly wound you. Family does. I reached into my purse for my phone, intending to call a taxi. That was when the screen lit up with a new text message. Unknown number. I opened it slowly. "He's asking for you." My heartbeat skipped. Before I could process the message, another appeared immediately after. "Mr. Whitmore just arrived." I stared at the words in confusion. Charles Whitmore. After all these years. Why would he ask for me? I looked back toward the ballroom instinctively. The atmosphere inside had suddenly shifted. People were straightening their posture. Staff members hurried across the floor. A ripple of excitement spread through the guests. The CEO is here. He just arrived. Charles Whitmore's entering now. Vanessa immediately rushed toward the center of the ballroom, smoothing her silver dress and fixing her smile. Michael adjusted his tuxedo nervously. Everyone suddenly looked desperate to impress someone. But I remained frozen near the doorway, with my phone trembling in my hand. Because deep down, I already knew this night was about to change everything. And for the first time since entering that ballroom, Vanessa Collins no longer felt like the most dangerous person in the room. The ballroom transformed the moment Charles Whitmore arrived. It happened almost instantly. Conversations lowered into nervous murmurs. Executives straightened their jackets. Women adjusted jewelry and posture as if royalty had entered the room instead of a businessman. Even the servers moved differently. Faster, sharper, more alert. Near the entrance, I remained frozen beside the marble column, still holding my phone tightly in my hand. My pulse thudded so hard against my ribs that it almost hurt. Mr. Whitmore just arrived. The message seemed unreal even now. I hadn't seen Charles in 35 years. 35. An entire lifetime. I considered leaving before he entered the ballroom. Part of me wanted to disappear quietly into the night before old memories could rise back to the surface. But another part of me, the younger version of myself, buried beneath years of struggle and grief, needed to know whether he still remembered. Across the room, Vanessa had completely changed her energy. The cruel amusement from earlier vanished instantly, replaced by polished elegance. She stood near the center of the ballroom with one hand resting lightly on Michael's arm, smiling at every executive who walked past. I watched her smooth down her silver gown for the third time in less than a minute. She wanted to impress Charles Whitmore. Everyone did. Michael spotted me still standing near the exit and walked over quickly. "Mom," he said under his breath, "where are you going?" I was heading home. What right now I looked at him carefully. For a moment, I searched his face for guilt, regret, shame over what had just happened. Instead, he only looked anxious. Not about me, about appearances. "You should stay," he whispered. "The CEO's about to speak." I almost laughed at the irony. Just minutes earlier, he had stood silently while people mocked me over an $18 dress. Now, suddenly, he wanted me nearby. "I don't think I belong here," I said softly. Michael sighed, rubbing his forehead. "Mom, please don't do this. Do what make tonight harder than it already is." The words hit me like cold water. Harder. I stared at my son in disbelief. "I embarrassed you that much?" I asked quietly. His expression shifted immediately. "That's not what I said. But it's what you meant." Michael looked away first. That told me everything. For several painful seconds, neither of us spoke. The ballroom lights shimmered across his tuxedo, while memories flooded my mind so suddenly, they nearly broke me. Michael, at 7 years old, crying because another boy teased his worn-out backpack. Michael at 13, apologizing after I caught him hiding holes in his sneakers with black marker. Michael at 17, promising me he would never forget where he came from. And now, here we were. My son dressed in luxury, while I stood before him, feeling smaller than I had in years. "I never cared about money," I whispered. Michael exhaled impatiently. "This isn't about money." "No," I said sadly. "It's about shame." His jaw tightened. "You're overreacting." That sentence hurt more than Vanessa's laughter. Because cruelty from strangers is one thing. Being emotionally abandoned by your own child is another kind of pain entirely. Before I could answer, Vanessa suddenly appeared beside us. "There you are," she said to Michael, smiling brightly. "Charles should be entering any second." Then her eyes moved toward me. "Oh, You're still here. Still here. As if my presence itself were inconvenient. Michael lowered his voice quickly. Mom was just leaving. Something flickered across Vanessa's face. Relief. Oh, she said softly. Well, if you're tired. I looked directly at her for the first time all evening. Vanessa was beautiful. Perfect makeup. Perfect posture. Perfect, wealthy confidence. But beneath all of it, I suddenly noticed something else. Fear. Not fear of me. Fear of losing status. People like Vanessa built their identities on social approval. They survived on admiration the way flowers survive on sunlight. And tonight, for the first time, something threatened her carefully controlled image. I think I should go, I repeated quietly. Michael nodded too quickly. Probably for the best. Those 4 words settled into my chest like a final betrayal. Probably for the best. I smiled weakly to stop my tears from falling. Then I adjusted the strap of my purse and turned toward the exit once more. That was when the ballroom speakers crackled softly overhead. A voice echoed through the room. Ladies and gentlemen, the announcer said warmly, please welcome the chairman and CEO of Whitmore Capital Group, Mr. Charles Whitmore. Thunderous applause exploded instantly. Everyone turned toward the grand staircase near the ballroom entrance, including me. And suddenly, there he was, older, gray-haired, distinguished, but unmistakably Charles. He descended the staircase slowly while flashes from cameras lit up around him. Executives rushed forward eagerly, each hoping for a handshake or brief conversation. But Charles barely seemed to notice them. His eyes were searching the room, looking for someone. At first, I told myself I was imagining it. Then his gaze stopped, directly on me. My breath caught. Everything around us seemed to disappear. The music, the applause, the conversations. For one suspended moment, it felt like 35 years collapsed into nothing. Charles Whitmore stared at me with an expression I couldn't immediately understand. Shock, emotion, relief. Then something happened that no one in that ballroom expected, including me. Instead of greeting the board members waiting beside the stage, Charles changed direction. Completely. People parted automatically as he walked through the crowd with quick, determined steps. Toward me. Whispers spread instantly. Where's he going? Who is that woman? Does he know her? Vanessa straightened immediately, suddenly smiling brighter as Charles approached. For one embarrassing second, I think she believed he was walking toward her. She even lifted her chin slightly and adjusted her posture. But Charles never looked at Vanessa, or Michael, or anyone else. His eyes remained locked on mine the entire time. My hands started trembling. Because suddenly I remembered the last time I saw him clearly. A young, desperate man sitting in my kitchen with tears in his eyes, admitting he had nothing left. And now, he stood before me as one of the richest men in America. When he finally stopped only inches away, the ballroom became completely silent. I saw confusion spread across Michael's face. Vanessa looked stunned. Charles stared at me for several emotional seconds before speaking softly. Abigail. Just hearing my name in his voice after all these years nearly shattered me. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. Then before anyone could react, Charles Whitmore stepped forward and wrapped his arms around me, tightly, like family, like gratitude, like a man embracing someone he had searched for far too long. Gasps erupted throughout the ballroom. Champagne glasses froze midair. Vanessa's entire face drained of color. And against my shoulder, I heard Charles whisper words that changed everything. I never forgot what you did for me. For several seconds, nobody in the ballroom moved. Charles Whitmore was still holding me in his arms, while hundreds of wealthy guests stared at us in stunned silence. I could actually hear the soft clinking of glasses somewhere near the back of the room. That was how quiet everything had become. When Charles finally stepped back, his hands remained gently on my shoulders, as if he needed to make sure I was real. His eyes looked emotional, almost overwhelmed. And suddenly, I saw flashes of the young man he used to be beneath the polished billionaire standing before me now. "Abigail," he said again, softly, shaking his head in disbelief. "After all these years?" I struggled to find my voice. "You remembered me." Charles gave a quiet laugh filled with emotion. "Remembered you?" he repeated. "There hasn't been a single year of my life when I forgot you." A ripple of whispers spread through the ballroom immediately. People looked confused, curious, desperate to understand why one of the most powerful CEOs in the country was speaking to an older woman in an $18 dress like she mattered more than anyone else in the room. I glanced toward Michael instinctively. His face had completely lost color. Beside him, Vanessa looked frozen in horror. Only minutes earlier, she had mocked me in front of everyone. Now, the CEO himself was standing beside me like I was someone important. Charles slowly turned toward the crowd while keeping one arm around me protectively. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said firmly, "I'd like you all to meet the woman who changed my life." The silence deepened. Vanessa blinked rapidly. Michael looked like he couldn't breathe. One executive near the front laughed nervously, clearly assuming Charles was joking. But Charles didn't smile. Not even slightly. Instead, he looked directly at me with unmistakable respect. "If not for Abigail Hernandez," he continued, "Whitmore Capital would not exist today." The entire ballroom erupted into shocked murmurs. I lowered my eyes, immediately overwhelmed by attention. "No, Charles," I whispered. "You built your company yourself?" He shook his head firmly. "I built it because you gave me the chance to survive." Michael suddenly stepped forward. "Sir," he said carefully, "I'm sorry, I think there must be some misunderstanding." Charles slowly turned toward him. The atmosphere shifted instantly. "Misunderstanding?" Charles repeated calmly. Michael swallowed hard. "I mean, my mother never mentioned knowing you." Charles stared at him for a long moment before asking quietly, "She never told you?" "No, sir." Something painful flickered across Charles's expression. Then he looked back at me with disbelief. "You really kept your promise all these years?" I smiled sadly. "I told you Michael needed to succeed on his own." Vanessa looked completely lost now. Her eyes darted between us, desperately trying to understand the conversation unraveling in front of everyone. Charles finally addressed the room again. 35 years ago, he began slowly, I was broke. Completely broke. The ballroom fell silent once more. I had debt collectors calling daily, banks rejecting every meeting, investors laughing me out of offices. He paused briefly. At one point, I was sleeping inside my car because I couldn't afford rent. No one moved. No one even breathed too loudly, because people rarely hear billionaires talk about failure. Charles looked down at me warmly. And then I met Abigail and her husband Thomas. The mention of Thomas's name tightened my chest instantly. They owned a tiny tailor shop in San Antonio. Charles continued. Nothing fancy. Just honest, hard-working people trying to survive. Memories flooded my mind immediately. The little shop with faded curtains. Thomas humming while repairing jackets. The smell of coffee and fabric filling the air late at night. Back then, we barely had enough money ourselves. but Thomas always believed kindness mattered more than comfort. Charles smiled, faintly lost in memory, too. I walked into their shop during the worst week of my life. My suit was torn. I had no money to repair it. He laughed softly. Honestly, I probably looked homeless. A few guests chuckled awkwardly, but nobody interrupted. Most people avoided me back then, Charles said quietly. I looked like failure. His eyes found mine again. But Abigail sat me down, brought me coffee, and listened. The ballroom remained absolutely still. She listened to me talk for nearly 2 hours, Charles continued. About my business idea, about the company I dreamed of building, about all the doors closing in my face. I remembered that conversation clearly now. A younger Charles with exhausted eyes and shaking hands wrapped around a coffee cup. Desperate men have a certain sadness about them. And Thomas and I recognized it immediately because we had lived it too. I still remember what Thomas said that night, Charles continued. My throat tightened. Charles smiled gently. He looked at Abigail and said, "Sometimes good people just need one person to believe in them." Tears filled my eyes instantly. That sounded exactly like Thomas, always believing in people before they believed in themselves. Charles exhaled slowly before continuing. The next morning, Abigail called me back to the shop. I closed my eyes briefly. I remembered that morning too. Thomas and I had stayed awake almost all night discussing whether we were crazy. Because the amount we planned to give Charles represented nearly everything we had saved over years of work. Money for emergencies. Money for Michael's future. Money protecting our survival. But something about Charles felt genuine, and Thomas trusted my instincts completely. Charles looked around the ballroom carefully now. Abigail and Thomas handed me an envelope containing nearly all their savings. Gasps spread across the room. Michael's eyes widened in disbelief. Vanessa looked horrified. I stared at the floor quietly, because hearing the story out loud made the sacrifice feel enormous all over again. I tried refusing, Charles said softly. I told them it was too much, that I might fail. His voice cracked slightly. But Abigail said something I have never forgotten. He turned fully toward me again. You told me, if you become successful, promise me you'll stay kind. My tears finally slipped free. Because I remembered saying exactly that. Back then, success had seemed so far away for all of us. Charles swallowed hard before continuing. That money kept my company alive long enough for one investor to finally say yes. He paused. One investor changed everything. The ballroom remained frozen in silence. Then Charles added quietly, I spent years trying to repay them. I shook my head gently. You already did. No, he said firmly. Not even close. Michael suddenly looked unsteady beside Vanessa. You gave him your savings, he whispered toward me. I looked at my son carefully. Yes. All of it, most of it. Michael stared at me like he no longer recognized his own mother. And maybe he didn't. Because children rarely understand how much their parents sacrifice until adulthood forces them to look honestly. Vanessa finally found her voice. But if this is true, she stammered, why would Abigail still live so? Modestly, Charles turned toward her slowly. The room instantly became tense again. Then in a calm voice, sharp enough to cut glass, he answered, because, unlike most people in this room, Abigail Hernandez never measured human worth by money. Vanessa's face burned crimson. Several guests immediately looked away from her in embarrassment, and for the first time all night, she had absolutely nothing to say. The ballroom remained unnaturally quiet after Charles's words, because suddenly the entire room was looking at me differently. Not with pity, not with amusement, but with something far more uncomfortable for people like Vanessa Collins. Respect. I wished they wouldn't. Attention has always made me uneasy. Thomas used to joke that I could sew wedding gowns for strangers all day, but panic if someone complimented my own blouse. So, while hundreds of eyes stayed fixed on me beneath the glittering chandeliers, all I wanted was to disappear quietly back into the life I understood. But Charles wasn't finished. He guided me gently toward one of the chairs near the front of the ballroom. "Sit with me," he said softly. "I'm fine standing. You've stood long enough in life." The tenderness in his voice nearly broke my heart. Slowly, I sat down beside him while guests continued whispering all around us. Michael and Vanessa remained standing nearby, both looking emotionally shattered in very different ways. Michael looked confused. Vanessa looked terrified. Charles accepted a glass of water from a server before turning toward the crowd again. "There's something else all of you should understand," he said calmly. I immediately shook my head. "Charles." But he only smiled gently. No more hiding. That sentence settled heavily inside my chest. Because hiding had become second nature to me over the years. Hiding struggle, hiding sacrifice, hiding pain, especially from Michael. Charles folded his hands together thoughtfully before continuing. "When Abigail and Thomas helped me, they weren't wealthy people making a comfortable investment." He paused. They were risking everything they had. Several guests lowered their eyes, perhaps imagining themselves making such a sacrifice. Most knew they never would. I stared down at my hands quietly, while memories rose so vividly that the ballroom around me almost disappeared. Back then, our tailor shop sat on a narrow street near the edge of San Antonio. The roof leaked whenever heavy rain came through. Half our customers paid late because they were struggling too. Some months, Thomas and I barely earned enough to cover utilities. Still, we survived. Barely. I remembered the exact night Charles first entered our shop. Rain poured outside so heavily that water seeped beneath the front door. I was hemming a bridesmaid dress while Thomas balanced receipts at the counter. Then the door opened. A young man stepped inside, wearing a soaked gray suit with a torn sleeve and exhaustion written across his face. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I know you're probably closing soon." Thomas glanced up and immediately smiled. "No problem. Come in." That was Thomas, always kind first. Charles explained he needed the jacket repaired before an important investor meeting the next morning. "I can pay later," he admitted awkwardly. I remember seeing humiliation burning behind his eyes, pride wounded by desperation. Thomas looked toward me briefly. Then he simply said, "We'll fix it. No judgment, no suspicion, just kindness." While Thomas repaired the jacket, Charles sat with me near the back sewing table, drinking coffee from one of our mismatched mugs. And somehow he started talking about everything. The business he'd dreamed of building, the technology nobody believed in, the banks rejecting him, the debt piling up, the fear of failure crushing him daily. "I know how crazy it sounds," he had said finally, with a defeated laugh. "Honestly, I think people look at me and see a man chasing impossible dreams." I remembered answering quietly, "Sometimes impossible dreams just need more time." Charles smiled faintly at the memory now. "She believed in me before there was anything to believe in," he told the ballroom. I lowered my eyes again, embarrassed. But the truth was more complicated than that. It wasn't belief in success. It was recognition. Thomas and I recognized struggle because we lived inside it too. Later that night, after Charles left the shop, Thomas and I sat together at our tiny kitchen table while rain battered the windows outside. "He's telling the truth," I whispered. Thomas nodded slowly. I know. He's desperate. I know. We sat in silence for several moments before I finally looked at him. What if we help him? Thomas stared at me carefully. Not angry, not shocked, just thoughtful. How much help are we talking about? I swallowed hard, all of it. Even now, 35 years later, I still remembered the silence that followed those words. Because all of it meant our savings account. Every extra dollar we had spent years building. Money meant for emergencies. Money protecting Michael's future. Money standing between our family and disaster. Finally, Thomas leaned back in his chair and sighed deeply. You trust him? Yes. Thomas looked down at his rough hands for a long moment. Then he smiled sadly. Well, he said softly, you've always had a better heart than me. I laughed through tears immediately. No, just a reckless one. He reached across the table and squeezed my hand. No, Abigail, he whispered. A brave one. Back in the ballroom, I blinked away tears while Charles continued speaking. The next morning, he said they handed me an envelope with nearly every dollar they had saved. Several guests looked visibly emotional now, especially the older ones. Because older people understand sacrifice differently. We know what it costs to hand someone your security, your future, your hope. I asked them why. Charles continued quietly. Why would you risk so much for someone you barely know? He looked directly at me again, and Abigail said something that changed my entire life. I closed my eyes briefly because I already knew what was coming. She said, money comes and goes, but if kindness disappears, the world becomes unbearable. The room fell silent again. I felt exposed hearing my own words repeated back after so many years, because at the time, they hadn't sounded wise or noble. They had simply sounded true. Charles smiled faintly. That sentence stayed with me through every success I've ever had. Michael slowly sat down nearby now, still looking pale. His eyes remained fixed on me like he was seeing his own mother for the first time. I don't understand, he said quietly. Why didn't you ever tell me any of this? I turned toward him slowly, because that question had waited decades to be answered. You were young, I said gently. But this is huge, Mom. No, I replied softly. You were huge. Michael frowned slightly. I continued carefully. Your father and I never wanted you growing up believing success would be handed to you through connections or favors. My voice trembled slightly. We wanted you to become strong on your own. Michael stared at me speechless. Charles nodded quietly beside me. She made me promise never to interfere in your future unless absolutely necessary. Vanessa suddenly looked confused. What do you mean? Interfere? Charles's expression shifted. Then he answered calmly, Michael's MBA scholarship. Michael blinked. What about it? Charles held his gaze steadily. It existed because your mother asked me to create it. The entire ballroom gasped again. Michael looked physically shaken now. No, he whispered. That scholarship was merit-based. It was, Charles replied. You earned it. But Abigail came to me privately when tuition costs became impossible after your father died. My son looked at me like his world was collapsing piece by piece. And maybe it was, because sometimes the hardest thing for children to accept is realizing how much their parents suffered silently to protect them. Michael looked like someone had knocked the air out of his body. He stared at me across the ballroom with wide, disbelieving eyes, while Charles's words echoed through the silent room. Your mother asked me to create it. For several long seconds, Michael couldn't speak at all. I recognized that expression immediately. It was the face of a child realizing his parents had suffered more than he ever imagined. No, he whispered finally. That can't be true. Charles remained calm. It is. Michael shook his head slowly. My scholarship committee said they selected me because of academic performance. They did, Charles answered. You earned your place. But after your father died, Abigail came to my office privately because she was afraid you'd turn down the program over tuition costs. My chest tightened painfully at the memory. I had hated that meeting, hated needing help, especially after spending my entire life trying to stand on my own feet. But Thomas had died only 3 months earlier, and the hospital bills had swallowed nearly everything we had left. Meanwhile, Michael's MBA acceptance letter sat on our kitchen table like both a dream and a threat. I still remembered him saying, "Maybe I should wait a year." "Mom?" "Wait." Because he knew we couldn't afford it anymore. That night, after Michael fell asleep on the couch from exhaustion, I sat alone in the dark, staring at Thomas's photograph for nearly 2 hours. Then the next morning, I called Charles. Not for charity, never charity. I only asked for opportunity. I didn't want him carrying the burden of our struggles, I said quietly now. Michael looked devastated. You sold Dad's truck after he died, he said slowly, as if remembering pieces of a puzzle. You told me it was because you didn't need it anymore. I lowered my eyes. That money paid your first semester housing deposit. His face crumpled slightly. And the life insurance, mostly hospital debt. Michael covered his mouth with one trembling hand. Around us, the ballroom remained completely silent. Nobody wanted to interrupt anymore, because the story had stopped being entertaining. Now it was personal, human, painful. Vanessa shifted uncomfortably beside him, clearly desperate for the attention to move elsewhere. But Charles wasn't finished. There's another thing everyone here deserves to know, he said firmly. I immediately looked up. Charles, please. He smiled gently at me. No more protecting people from the truth. Vanessa stiffened visibly at those words. Charles turned toward the crowd again. When Abigail first invested in my company, I offered her formal shares. Whispers spread instantly again. Investors nearby exchanged startled glances. But she refused to profit from my desperation, Charles continued. So instead, I created something called a legacy agreement. Michael frowned. What's that? Charles looked directly at him. It means your mother still owns honorary founding shares in Whitmore Capital. The room exploded into shocked murmurs. Vanessa's champagne glass nearly slipped from her hand. Michael stared blankly, but Charles remained composed. She has for 35 years. I closed my eyes briefly, overwhelmed all over again. Those shares had never mattered much to me personally. I rarely even thought about them anymore. But Charles insisted years ago. If this company survives, he had told me part of it will always belong to the Hernandez family. At the time, I thought he was simply emotional and grateful. None of us imagined Whitmore Capital would become a billion-dollar empire. Michael looked completely stunned. Mom, he whispered. Why would you never tell me this? I met his eyes carefully, because I didn't want you growing up entitled. His face tightened immediately with emotion. I'm your son. Yes, I said softly, which is exactly why I wanted you to build your own life. Vanessa suddenly found her voice again. Well, honorary shares aren't necessarily financial ownership, she said quickly, forcing a nervous smile. The desperation beneath her tone was obvious. She needed this revelation to feel smaller, less humiliating. Charles slowly turned toward her. They include annual dividends, he said calmly. Vanessa went completely pale. A few executives nearby actually looked embarrassed for her now, because everyone in the room understood what she had done earlier. She mocked an older woman over an $18 dress, without realizing that woman quietly held a piece of the company her husband worked for. But the truth was even deeper than that. I wasn't humiliated because I was poor. I was humiliated because people assumed simplicity meant worthlessness. Charles stepped slightly closer to me again. Abigail has donated nearly every dividend payment over the years, he continued. Now even I looked surprised. Charles, you know it's true. He turned toward the audience. She funded employee hardship programs anonymously, education grants, emergency assistance for widows. He paused, and she never wanted recognition. Michael stared at me like his heart was breaking in real time. You donated it, he whispered. I shrugged softly. There were people who needed it more. Vanessa blinked rapidly. But if you had that kind of money, she stammered, why live the way you do? The question hung heavily in the room. Charles looked disappointed by it. But honestly, I wasn't angry. Because people like Vanessa genuinely believed wealth existed to display superiority. The idea of having resources and not showing them made no sense to her. I answered before Charles could. Because money only changes who you are if you worship it, I said quietly. The ballroom fell silent again. I continued softly. Thomas and I spent our whole lives surrounded by hardworking people. Some had money, some didn't. But the kindest people we ever met were usually the ones who understood struggle. Vanessa looked down immediately. For the first time all evening, she seemed unable to maintain her polished confidence. Meanwhile, Michael looked emotionally destroyed. Tears filled his eyes as memories clearly surfaced one after another. All the birthdays, all the tuition payments, all the sacrifices he never questioned, because I never allowed him to see the cost. You worked extra jobs after Dad died, he whispered suddenly. I nodded slightly. You told me it was because you liked staying busy. I needed the insurance. His eyes closed briefly. And the nights you sounded tired on the phone? I smiled sadly. I usually finished sewing around 2 a.m. Michael looked away immediately, unable to hide his tears anymore. That moment hurt me almost as much as the humiliation earlier. Because no mother wants her child drowning in guilt, even when they deserve some of it. Charles finally placed one hand gently on Michael's shoulder. Your mother protected your future fiercely, he said quietly. Everything she did came from love. Michael nodded shakily. Then slowly he turned toward me. And for the first time all night, he truly looked ashamed. Not of me, of himself. The ballroom no longer felt glamorous. Not after the truth came out. The crystal chandeliers still sparkled overhead. Champagne still flowed through the crowd. Soft music still drifted from the string quartet near the stage. But underneath all the elegance, something raw and uncomfortable had settled over the room. Reality. And reality is never as polished as wealth tries to make it appear. Michael stood motionless only a few feet away from me, his face pale and exhausted. The confident executive everyone admired earlier had disappeared completely. Now he looked like a lost little boy again. I had not seen that expression since the day Thomas died. Mom, he said quietly. His voice cracked on the word. My chest tightened instantly. No matter how badly children hurt us hearing them sound broken, still wounds a mother. I slowly stood from my chair, smoothing the wrinkles from my inexpensive navy dress out of habit. Michael looked down at the fabric immediately. The same dress he had silently allowed people to mock. The realization clearly hit him all over again. I didn't know, he whispered. I gave a small, sad smile. I know. No. You don't understand. He shook his head quickly. I really didn't know any of this. Charles remained nearby but wisely said nothing. This was no longer his moment. It belonged to a mother and son, standing in the ruins of years neither of them fully understood. Michael swallowed hard before continuing. All those times you said you were okay. His eyes filled again. You weren't okay at all. I looked at him gently. Parents don't usually tell their children how scared they are. That sentence seemed to destroy something inside him. He covered his mouth briefly while trying to control his emotions. Several guests nearby looked away respectfully now, pretending not to listen while listening to every word. Because suffering humbles people. And tonight, my son was finally being humbled. I thought... Michael stopped struggling for air. I thought Dad's life insurance covered everything. It covered enough for us to survive. But you worked all those extra hours. I nodded softly. There were bills. His eyes dropped to my hands. Old hands. Hands shaped by decades of sewing, scrubbing, lifting, surviving. Hands he had stopped truly seeing years ago. I watched him notice the tiny scars near my fingers for the first time in a very long while. Little white marks left by sewing needles over decades. Thomas used to kiss those scars jokingly and call them badges of love. Michael stared at them silently. Then suddenly painfully he asked, "How many times did you skip meals?" The ballroom became so quiet I could hear someone set down a wine glass nearby. I hadn't expected that question. Not because it wasn't true. Because I never thought Michael noticed. I tried smiling lightly. "Oh, sweetheart. Please," he whispered. "Don't lie to me anymore." My throat tightened. So I answered honestly. Sometimes, near the end of the month, I admitted softly. But it wasn't a big deal. Michael closed his eyes immediately, like the words physically hurt him. And maybe they did, because children remember hunger differently when they realize their parents were hiding it. I remembered one winter especially clearly. Michael was 16. His school held an expensive academic competition trip in Austin, and he desperately wanted to go. The fee wasn't enormous by wealthy standards, but for us, it may as well have been impossible. That month, Thomas and I quietly lived on canned soup and toast for nearly 2 weeks to pay for it. Michael never knew. At least, I thought he didn't. "I used to hear you in the kitchen late at night," Michael said suddenly. I looked at him carefully. "You did. You thought I was asleep." His voice trembled. "I heard you crying sometimes." Tears filled my eyes instantly. Because mothers always believe they hide pain better than they actually do. "I'm sorry," I whispered. His face twisted in disbelief. "Sorry," he repeated. "Mom, why are you apologizing to me?" Because mothers apologize for everything. For struggle. For grief. For not being able to protect their children from life. Even when they've already sacrificed everything. Michael wiped at his eyes roughly before looking around the ballroom in shame. Then his gaze landed on Vanessa. She stood several feet away, now completely isolated from the crowd. People who had laughed with her earlier suddenly avoided eye contact. Funny how quickly cruelty becomes embarrassing when power shifts. Vanessa crossed her arms tightly. "I didn't know all this either," she said defensively. No one answered. Not even Michael. She took a shaky breath. "How was I supposed to know?" Charles finally spoke again, calm, but cold. "You weren't supposed to know she had money," he said. "You were supposed to treat her with dignity anyway." The sentence hit the room like another slap. Vanessa's face flushed red instantly. "I never meant, yes?" "You did," Michael interrupted quietly. Everyone looked at him. His voice wasn't loud. That made it worse. "I heard you laughing," he continued, "and I let it happen." His eyes slowly returned to me. That's on me. For the first time all evening, I saw genuine shame in my son. Not performative guilt, not embarrassment over public exposure. Real shame. The kind that changes people if they let it. Charles stepped closer beside him. "You're talented, Michael," he said calmly. "You work hard. You've earned your career." Michael nodded weakly. But character matters more than talent. The room remained silent. Charles continued. "I've watched people build fortunes and still become spiritually bankrupt." His gaze sharpened slightly. "Success means nothing if you forget the people who carried you there." Michael lowered his head completely. "I know." "No," Charles corrected softly. "Tonight you finally understand." Those words settled heavily over everyone, especially me. Because deep down, I realized something painful too. I had spent years protecting Michael from hardship so thoroughly that maybe he forgot what hardship looked like. Not intentionally. Gradually. Success had surrounded him with polished people, expensive places, carefully curated appearances. And somewhere along the way, he started seeing simplicity as failure. The same way Vanessa did. Except Vanessa had been raised that way. Michael had simply forgotten better. "I failed you," he whispered suddenly. I shook my head immediately. "No." "Yes." Tears slid down his face openly now. "You stood there while they laughed at you, and I cared more about appearances than protecting my own mother." Hearing him finally say it aloud pierced something deep inside me, because that was the true wound. Not Vanessa's cruelty, Michael's silence. I stepped closer carefully. "You hurt me tonight," I admitted softly. He flinched immediately. "But you are still my son." His face crumpled completely then. "I'm so sorry, Mom." The words sounded broken, real. And for one dangerous moment, I almost forgave everything instantly. That's the weakness of motherhood. We love before healing finishes. But before I could answer, Charles quietly cleared his throat. "There's one more thing," he said. The ballroom tensed again. Charles looked directly at Michael now. "The board planned to announce your promotion tonight." Michael blinked in confusion. "What you were being considered for regional partner." Vanessa's head snapped upward instantly, but Charles's expression remained unreadable. "We're being," he repeated carefully. A cold silence spread through the ballroom. Michael stared at him slowly, and suddenly, everyone understood what those words meant. The silence after Charles's words felt unbearable. You were being considered for regional partner. Nobody in the ballroom moved. Nobody even pretended to sip champagne anymore. Because everyone understood exactly what had happened. Michael's future, the promotion he had probably worked years for, was suddenly hanging by a thread. And Vanessa knew it too. Her face lost what little color remained. "What does that mean?" she asked quickly, her voice too sharp. "We're being considered." Charles looked at her calmly. "It means the board and I will need additional time before making that decision." Vanessa stared at him in disbelief. "You're delaying his promotion over this?" Charles's expression hardened slightly. "No," he said evenly. "I'm delaying it because leadership reveals itself in moments like this." The tension in the room became suffocating. Michael lowered his head immediately. But Vanessa wasn't finished. "That's ridiculous," she snapped before she could stop herself. "Michael is one of the best executives in this company." Several people nearby exchanged uncomfortable glances. Charles remained perfectly composed. "I agree," he replied. "He's intelligent, ambitious, and capable." "Then this shouldn't matter." "Oh," Charles said quietly, "it matters very much." His voice never rose. That somehow made him more intimidating. Vanessa crossed her arms tightly. So now someone's personal feelings affect business decisions. The second those words left her mouth, I saw Michael close his eyes briefly in frustration. Because Vanessa still didn't understand the real issue. This was never about my feelings. It was about character. Charles stepped slightly closer toward her. "Mrs. Collins," he said calmly, "do you know why I built employee assistance programs into this company?" Vanessa hesitated. "No. Because I remember what it feels like to be treated like you're worthless when you're struggling." The room fell quiet again. Charles continued. "I built this company believing success should make people kinder." His eyes sharpened slightly, not crueler. Vanessa looked away. For the first time that evening, her confidence appeared genuinely shaken. But then something ugly surfaced beneath the cracks. Anger. Not regret. Anger. She looked toward me suddenly. "This entire thing is unbelievable," she muttered. She could have said something earlier. The words hit me harder than I expected. Because even now, even after everything, Vanessa still believed money was the issue. As if my mistake had been failing to announce my value loudly enough. Charles looked disappointed. Michael looked horrified. But Vanessa kept going, unable to stop herself. "You let everyone think you were poor," I answered softly. "I am not wealthy, Vanessa." "Oh, please," she scoffed. "You own part of the company. I own honorary shares I rarely touch. That's still more than most people here." I shook my head gently. "You still don't understand?" Vanessa laughed bitterly. "No, I understand perfectly now. You embarrassed us on purpose." That sentence finally made Michael react. "Stop," he said sharply. Vanessa turned toward him in disbelief. "What you need to stop talking." Her eyes widened instantly. Michael had never spoken to her that way before. Not once. But years of carefully maintained control were cracking apart around him tonight. Vanessa stared at him stunned. "You're seriously defending this?" she whispered. Michael looked at her like he no longer recognized her. "My mother was humiliated in front of this entire room." Vanessa scoffed immediately. "She's fine." That sentence changed something in Michael's face. Not dramatically, quietly, like a final thread snapping. "She's not fine," he said softly. I saw it then, the moment my son truly began seeing me again. Not as background, not as obligation, not as the simple woman from San Antonio who embarrassed his polished life, but as a human being, a mother, the woman who carried him through hardship he never fully noticed. Vanessa looked around nervously, suddenly realizing the crowd surrounding them was no longer sympathetic. People were watching her carefully now, judging, the same way she had judged me earlier. Funny how quickly the room changes when power shifts direction. Trying to regain control, Vanessa forced a brittle smile and turned towards several nearby guests. "I think this entire evening has become emotional for everyone," she said lightly. Nobody laughed. Nobody rescued her. The silence that followed felt brutal. Then from across the ballroom, a young server accidentally bumped into Vanessa while carrying a tray of champagne glasses. A splash of champagne hit the side of her silver gown. It wasn't even much. Just a few drops. But Vanessa exploded instantly. "Watch where you're going!" she snapped loudly. The young server, barely older than 20, turned pale immediately. "I'm so sorry, ma'am. Do you have any idea how expensive this dress is?" The entire ballroom went still again. The server looked terrified, and suddenly I saw something deeply familiar in the young girl's eyes. Shame. The kind wealthy people casually create without thinking. Vanessa continued angrily. "This is exactly what happens when hotels hire careless people." Charles's face darkened immediately. The young server kept apologizing shakily. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I didn't mean—" "Oh, obviously you didn't mean to," Vanessa interrupted coldly. "That doesn't make it less incompetent." Michael looked horrified. "Vanessa," he muttered, but she kept going. Because people reveal their true character most clearly when they believe someone beneath them has made a mistake. And tonight, Vanessa Collins was unraveling completely. Charles walked slowly toward the trembling server. Then he gently took the tray from her shaking hands himself. "It's all right," he said kindly. "Go take a moment." The young woman looked close to tears. "Thank you, sir." She hurried away quickly. Charles then turned toward Vanessa, and for the first time all evening, his disappointment became unmistakable. "My mother cleaned hotel rooms for 15 years, he said quietly. Vanessa froze. She worked double shifts while people in expensive clothes spoke to her exactly the way you just spoke to that young woman. Nobody in the ballroom dared move. Charles continued calmly. One of the fastest ways to understand who someone truly is. His eyes locked onto Vanessa's. Is watching how they treat people who cannot benefit them. Vanessa's face burned crimson. Michael looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him alive. And honestly, I almost pitied him. Because discovering your spouse lacks kindness is its own kind of heartbreak. Charles handed his champagne glass to another server before speaking again. Effective immediately, he said calmly. "Mrs. Collins will no longer participate in the Whitmore Foundation Charity Board." Gasps spread immediately. Vanessa blinked rapidly. "What?" "The foundation represents vulnerable families, struggling workers, and scholarship recipients." Charles's voice remained steady. "You are clearly not suited for that responsibility. You can't be serious." "I'm entirely serious." Vanessa looked at Michael desperately now. "Say something." Michael stared at her silently for several seconds, and then came the moment that truly changed everything. Because for the first time, my son did not rush to protect his wife's image. Instead, he looked at her with exhaustion and quiet disappointment. "How many times," he asked softly, "did you tell me sending money to my mother was encouraging dependency?" Vanessa went pale instantly. My heart stopped, because suddenly, I understood something too. Michael looked away bitterly. I thought those were my ideas. The room became deathly silent, and Vanessa's expression revealed the truth before she even spoke. Vanessa's silence answered the question before her lips ever moved. Michael stared at her as realization spread slowly across his face like a crack moving through glass. "All those times," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Every time I wanted to help Mom more." Vanessa crossed her arms defensively. "I was trying to protect our future." Michael gave a hollow laugh. "Our future." His voice sounded tired now. Not angry, just exhausted. "You told me my mother needed to learn independence. She does." That sentence finally made something harden in Michael's eyes, and I knew that look, because it was the same expression Thomas used to get whenever someone crossed a line he could no longer excuse. "She raised me alone after Dad died," Michael said softly. "She worked herself sick to keep my future alive." Vanessa opened her mouth to respond, but Michael continued before she could. "And tonight, you laughed at her because of a dress." The ballroom remained painfully silent around us. People had stopped pretending not to watch anymore. Because this wasn't entertainment now, it was collapse. The collapse of carefully constructed images. Vanessa's polished social mask. Michael's illusion about his own success. Even my own lifelong habit of staying silent to keep peace. Everything was cracking open beneath those crystal chandeliers. Vanessa glanced around nervously, clearly realizing she no longer controlled the room. "You're making me sound heartless," she whispered. Michael looked at her in disbelief. "You did that yourself." That sentence seemed to hit her harder than anything Charles had said all night. Because deep down, Vanessa probably believed Michael would always choose her version of reality over anyone else's, including mine. Especially mine. But tonight, for the first time, my son was finally seeing the full picture. And truth changes people, sometimes painfully. I quietly picked up my purse from the chair beside me. The movement drew Charles's attention immediately. "You're leaving?" he asked gently. I nodded. "I think it's time." Michael turned toward me instantly. "Mom, wait. No, sweetheart." I smiled softly, though my chest still ached. I've had enough attention for one night. The truth was, I suddenly felt very tired. Not physically, emotionally. Years of swallowed hurt had finally surfaced all at once, and my heart didn't know what to do with it. Charles stood beside me immediately. "At least let my driver take you home. You've already done too much." His expression softened. Not even close. I touched his arm gently. "Thomas would have been proud of the man you became." Emotion flashed across Charles's face immediately. For one second, he looked like that struggling young businessman again. Not a billionaire, just a man remembering the people who once believed in him. "He believed in me before I deserved it," Charles said quietly. "He believed in everybody." Charles smiled sadly. "Yes, that's rare." Around us, guests slowly began clapping, softly at first, then louder. The sound startled me completely. I looked around in confusion as dozens of people rose from their seats one after another. A standing ovation. For me. My throat tightened instantly. Only an hour earlier, some of those same people had laughed while Vanessa mocked my $18 dress. Now they stood applauding as if they had always respected me. Funny how quickly public opinion changes when wealth and power redirect it. But strangely, I wasn't angry anymore, just sad. Because kindness should never depend on status. I looked down at my dress beneath the ballroom lights. The carefully stitched sleeve, the uneven fabric, the inexpensive shoes. Earlier tonight, I had felt humiliated wearing it. Now suddenly, none of it embarrassed me anymore. Because dignity isn't something expensive people give you. It's something you carry inside yourself. Michael stepped closer carefully. His eyes were still red. "Mom?" he whispered. I looked at him quietly. "I'm sorry." The pain in his voice was real. I knew that, but some wounds don't close the moment apologies appear. Not even between mothers and sons. "I know you are," I said softly. Tears filled his eyes again immediately. "I failed you tonight." I swallowed hard. "Yes," I answered honestly. The word nearly destroyed him. But truth matters more than comfort sometimes. Michael lowered his head completely. "I don't know how I became this person." My chest tightened painfully at that. Because despite everything, hearing your child hate himself still hurts. I reached up and touched his cheek gently the way I used to when he was little. "You are not a bad man, Michael." His eyes closed immediately. But tonight, I continued softly. "You are a weak one." Tears slipped down his face openly now. And for the first time all evening, nobody looked away from his pain. Because accountability feels different when it's deserved. "I thought success meant fitting in," he whispered. "That's because you spent too much time around people terrified of being ordinary." My eyes shifted briefly toward Vanessa. She stood frozen several feet away, completely isolated now. Not one person stood beside her anymore. Not one. The loneliness on her face almost looked frightening. But even then, something inside me refused to hate her completely. Cruel people are often deeply insecure people. Vanessa built her entire identity around status because she didn't know who she was without it. Still, pain explains behavior. It does not excuse it. Charles glanced toward the ballroom stage. "They're waiting for my speech," he said quietly. I smiled faintly. "Then don't keep your empire waiting." He laughed softly before growing serious again. "Abigail, before you go," he gently reached for my hand, "you spent your whole life giving people dignity when they least deserved it." His eyes glistened slightly. "This company exists because of that." Emotion swelled painfully inside my chest. Because nobody had ever described my life that way before. I had always thought I was simply surviving, doing what mothers do, doing what decent people should do. Nothing extraordinary. But maybe ordinary kindness becomes extraordinary in a world starving for it. Charles then did something unexpected. He turned toward the crowd once more. "Before Mrs. Hernandez leaves tonight," he announced calmly, "there's one thing I'd like everyone here to remember." The ballroom fell silent immediately. Charles looked around slowly before continuing. "A person's value is never stitched into a price tag." My breath caught instantly. Those were my words. Words I had whispered years ago to a young, struggling man in a tiny tailor shop. Now they echoed through one of the wealthiest rooms in Texas. And suddenly, my $18 dress no longer felt small at all. The ballroom erupted into applause again. But this time, I didn't lower my eyes in embarrassment. I stood tall. Not because people finally respected me, because I finally remembered I deserved respect long before they offered it. Michael walked beside me as I slowly headed toward the ballroom exit. Halfway there, he whispered shakily, "I don't deserve your forgiveness yet." I looked at him carefully. "No," I said softly. "You don't." The truth hit him visibly, but I continued before shame could crush him completely. "That doesn't mean you can't earn it." For the first time all evening, a small, fragile hope appeared in my son's eyes. 3 days passed before I saw Michael again. 3 long, quiet days. Part of me expected him to disappear back into his polished Dallas life once the embarrassment faded. People often become emotional in public and then return to old habits once comfort returns. But deep down, I hoped my son was better than that. On the 3rd morning, I was sitting at my kitchen table, hemming a little pink flower girl dress for a customer, when I heard a knock at the front door. Not the quick knock of delivery drivers, not Rosa's cheerful pounding. Slow, hesitant. I already knew who it was before I opened the door. Michael stood on my porch wearing jeans and a wrinkled button-down shirt instead of one of his expensive suits. Dark circles shadowed his eyes like he hadn't slept properly in days. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he looked down quietly and said, "Hi, Mom." The pain in his voice wrapped around my heart instantly. I stepped aside without a word. "Come in." Michael entered, slowly glancing around the small house like he was seeing it for the first time. Maybe he was. The old couch, the faded curtains, the photographs lining the walls, the sewing machine beside the kitchen table. None of it had changed. But Michael had. Or maybe the problem was that he hadn't noticed how little had changed for me, while his own world became larger and richer every year. "You still have this?" he asked softly, touching the wooden shelf Thomas built decades ago. "Of course." His fingers moved carefully across the worn surface. I made this with Dad when I was 12. I smiled faintly. You hammered your thumb twice. A weak laugh escaped him before his expression crumbled again. The silence that followed felt heavy. Not hostile. Just full of things neither of us knew how to say yet. I made coffee, I said gently. Do you want some? He nodded immediately. While I poured 2 cups at the counter, I could feel him watching me quietly behind me. Like he was trying to understand all the years he missed. When I handed him the mug, his eyes suddenly filled with tears again. You still use Dad's mug? I glanced at the faded ceramic cup in my hand. Some things become part of you. Michael lowered his eyes quickly. That sentence clearly hurt him, because he had spent years letting important things become replaceable. People, time, family. He sat down slowly at the kitchen table while I returned to hemming the little pink dress. For several minutes, only the soft sound of the sewing machine filled the room. Finally, Michael whispered, I haven't stopped thinking about that night. I kept sewing quietly. I'm glad. The honesty surprised him. His eyes lifted toward me immediately. You're angry. I paused for a moment before answering. No, I said softly. I'm hurt. That seemed worse somehow. Michael rubbed both hands over his face tiredly. You should be angry. I was. His voice cracked slightly. Mom! I looked up at him carefully. You let people laugh at me. Tears instantly filled his eyes again. I know. You looked embarrassed to be my son. He shook his head quickly. No, yes. I interrupted gently. You did. The truth settled heavily between us. Michael stared down at the table. I don't know when I became someone capable of that. I sighed quietly. It happened slowly. He looked up again. What does forgetting people who sacrificed for you? The words weren't cruel. That somehow made them more painful. Michael swallowed hard. I never forgot you. I gave him a sad smile. No, sweetheart. You forgot what life cost us. Silence filled the kitchen again. Outside, a dog barked somewhere down the street while sunlight filtered softly through the curtains Thomas and I once picked out together. This house had witnessed every version of my son. Little boy, teenager, graduate, successful businessman, and now, a grown man trying to face himself honestly for the first time in years. Michael's gaze slowly drifted toward my hands again. You still sew every day? I like staying busy. That's what you always say when you're struggling. The observation startled me slightly. Because maybe my son noticed more than I believed. Just not enough. I should have helped you more, he whispered. You sent money sometimes. Not enough. I remained quiet. Michael exhaled shakily before continuing. There were months Vanessa said sending too much would make you dependent. Shame flooded his face immediately, and I listened. I looked at him carefully. Why? He hesitated, then finally answered honestly, because somewhere along the way, I started believing success meant leaving struggle behind completely. My chest tightened. And what does that mean? That poor people stay poor because they don't try hard enough? He looked sick, saying the words aloud. God, I actually started thinking like that. I stared at him silently. Because hearing your child repeat cruel beliefs feels like mourning someone still alive. Michael wiped his eyes quickly. But then, I saw you standing there in that ballroom. His voice broke, and I realized the strongest person I know spent her entire life struggling. I finally set down my sewing carefully. You know what hurts most? He shook his head. It wasn't Vanessa laughing. Tears slid down his face again immediately. It was you staying quiet. Michael completely broke then. Real grief poured out of him all at once. I'm sorry, he whispered repeatedly. Mom, I'm so sorry. He cried like he used to as a child after nightmares. Raw, uncontrolled, and despite everything. My first instinct was still to comfort him. That's motherhood. Even wounded hearts still reach toward their children. I moved beside him slowly and placed one hand against his hair. Michael leaned into me immediately, like he had been emotionally starving for years. I failed Dad too, he whispered through tears. My own eyes filled instantly. Oh, sweetheart. He would have hated the man I became that night. I thought about Thomas for a long moment. Then I answered honestly, he would have hated your choices. I touched Michael's cheek gently, but never you. Michael cried harder after that, because fathers like Thomas loved deeply enough to leave echoes behind long after death. Eventually, Michael looked around the small kitchen again. The old refrigerator, the worn linoleum floors, the faded curtains, and suddenly he whispered something that shattered me completely. You stayed here alone all these years. I smiled sadly. This house still feels full to me. Because of Dad. Yes. His voice trembled, and because of me, I looked at my son carefully, then answered with complete honesty. Because every sacrifice we made here built your future. Tears streamed down his face again. Michael took a shaky breath before whispering, I don't deserve forgiveness. I thought about that carefully. Then I answered softly, no. Not yet. Pain crossed his face immediately. But before despair could swallow him completely, I continued. Forgiveness is not words, Michael. He looked at me silently. It's change. The room became still. You want my forgiveness? I asked gently. Then become the kind of man your father believed you already were. Michael stared at me with tears in his eyes. And for the first time in years, I think my son finally understood that love is not proven by success. It is proven by character. Change did not happen overnight. Real change never does. People love dramatic apologies because they feel satisfying. One emotional speech, one tearful moment, one grand gesture, but character is not rebuilt in a single night. It is rebuilt quietly, repeatedly, day after day. And to Michael's credit, he tried. The first sign came the following Sunday. I was watering the small rose bushes near my porch when his black luxury SUV pulled into my driveway again. This time, he wasn't wearing expensive loafers or a pressed designer shirt. Just jeans, sneakers, and nervousness written all over his face. You didn't have to drive 3 hours for a visit, I said as he walked toward me. Yes, I did. Simple answer. No excuses. That mattered. He spent the afternoon helping me repair the broken fence behind the house. For the first hour, we barely spoke. But unlike before, the silence didn't feel distant. It felt careful, like two people learning how to know each other again. At one point, I caught him staring at his hands while tightening a loose board. What I asked softly? He laughed weakly. I forgot how hard manual work is? That's because you sit in meetings all day now. He looked down. Dad used to do this after 12-hour shifts. The guilt still lived inside him heavily. I could see it in everything. The way he noticed details now, the way he looked around the house differently, the way he listened when I spoke instead of glancing at his phone every few minutes. Awareness changes people, and awareness can hurt. Later that afternoon, while we sat drinking iced tea on the porch, Michael finally asked the question I knew had been haunting him. Do you think Dad would be disappointed in me? I looked out toward the quiet neighborhood for a long moment before answering. Thomas believed people should be judged by what they do after failure. Michael stayed silent, so I continued. Your father made mistakes too. He frowned slightly. Dad? I smiled faintly. Oh, sweetheart, your father once lost almost 6 months of rent money because he trusted the wrong business partner. Michael blinked in surprise. He never told me that, because parents usually hide their worst moments from their children. He looked down at his glass thoughtfully. What happened? He worked 2 jobs until we recovered. I smiled softly at the memory, and every night he kept saying the same thing. I'll never let pride matter more than people. Michael's eyes filled quietly. That sentence stayed with him, I could tell. Over the next several weeks, he began visiting regularly, not out of obligation, choice. Sometimes he brought groceries, even though I told him not to. Sometimes he fixed things around the house that had been broken for years because I kept putting repairs off to save money. One Saturday, I walked into the kitchen and found him replacing the old faucet. You hired a plumber? I asked. Michael shook his head while tightening something beneath the sink. No. I watched tutorials. I laughed softly. You used to hate fixing things. I used to hate a lot of honest things. That sentence stayed with me all day. Meanwhile, things between Michael and Vanessa were clearly deteriorating. At first, he avoided discussing her. But pain always surfaces eventually. One evening, while helping me organize old photographs, he suddenly said, "She thinks I'm ruining our future." I carefully placed another photo album aside. Because you're spending time with me, because I'm changing. I looked at him quietly. And are you? He nodded slowly. Yes, there was no pride in the answer. Only honesty. That mattered too. A few days later, Michael surprised me again by arriving unexpectedly on a Thursday evening. But this time, Vanessa came with him. The moment I saw her step out of the passenger seat, tension settled immediately into my chest. Vanessa looked uncomfortable standing in front of my small house. She wore expensive cream-colored clothes, even for a casual visit, like she physically could not exist without looking polished. Michael glanced at her firmly before speaking. Vanessa has something she wants to say? Vanessa looked at him sharply, then at me, then away again. For several painful seconds, nobody spoke. Finally, she exhaled quietly. I owe you an apology. The words sounded stiff, careful, unnatural, but apologies rarely arrive perfectly from proud people. I waited silently. Vanessa crossed her arms defensively before forcing herself to continue. What I said at the gala was cruel. Yes, it was, but I stayed quiet, and I judged you unfairly. That was true too. She swallowed hard. I grew up around people who cared about appearances constantly. Her eyes lowered briefly. I thought success meant never looking poor. There it was. Not kindness, but honesty. And honestly, that was more than I expected. Michael watched her closely the entire time, not controlling, not rescuing, just waiting to see whether she could finally speak truthfully. Vanessa looked back at me awkwardly. When I saw your dress that night, she hesitated. I thought you didn't belong there. I smiled sadly. A lot of people did. Her face tightened immediately. And for the first time, I think she truly understood that cruelty lingers inside people long after embarrassment fades. I was wrong, she whispered finally. The apology wasn't emotional, it wasn't graceful, but it was real enough. And sometimes, that's where change begins. I nodded slowly. Thank you for saying that. Relief flickered across her face instantly. But I continued before she could mistake forgiveness for forgetting. However, I said gently, you don't get to treat people poorly just because you later regret it. Vanessa looked down immediately. I know. No, I corrected softly. You're beginning to learn. The porch fell quiet. Then Michael did something that surprised both of us. He reached for my hand openly, without hesitation, without embarrassment. The same son who once stayed silent while people laughed at me now sat proudly beside me in public view. That small gesture mattered more than grand speeches ever could. Vanessa noticed it too. And I think, for the first time, she realized something important. Michael was no longer willing to build his identity around other people's approval. Later that evening, after Vanessa waited in the car, Michael helped me clean dishes inside the kitchen. While drying a plate, he suddenly asked quietly, "Do you think she can change?" I thought carefully before answering. People can change if losing something finally becomes more painful than protecting their pride. Michael nodded slowly. And what if they don't? I looked at my son carefully. Then you decide what kind of life you're willing to live. He stood silently for several moments, then finally whispered, I spent years becoming successful. His eyes lifted toward mine. But I think this is the first time in a long while I've actually respected myself. My throat tightened instantly, because that was the moment I knew something had truly shifted inside him. Not perfectly, not completely, but genuinely, and genuine change is rare. 1 year later, I stood in front of my bedroom mirror, holding the same navy blue dress in my hands. The $18 dress, the dress that once made an entire ballroom laugh at me. I ran my fingers slowly across the fabric, while early evening sunlight spilled through my curtains. Over the past year, I had repaired the stitching twice more. I added a softer lining beneath the sleeves and replaced the old buttons with simple pearl ones Michael bought for me during one of his visits to San Antonio. The dress still wasn't expensive, still wasn't glamorous. But somehow it no longer looked small. Neither did I. A knock sounded gently at my front door. I smiled before opening it because I already knew who it was. Michael stood there in a dark navy suit, holding a small box of white roses. But this time, there was no distance in his eyes. No embarrassment, only warmth. You look beautiful, Mom, he said immediately. And this time, I believed him. I laughed softly. You haven't even seen the whole dress yet. I don't need to. Emotion tightened my throat instantly, because a year ago, my son measured worth through appearances without even realizing it. Now he saw people first. That change mattered more than any promotion ever could. As we drove toward Dallas together, Michael talked about work community programs and the employee scholarship initiatives he'd spent the past year expanding. Charles had eventually approved his promotion 6 months earlier. Not because of his performance, because of his growth. There's a difference. Michael understood that now. Charles keeps pushing the mentorship program, he said while driving. He says leadership should protect people, not intimidate them. I smiled faintly. That sounds like him. Michael glanced at me briefly. He talks about you constantly. I shook my head with quiet embarrassment. He exaggerates. No, Michael said softly. I think he finally met someone who taught him what success was supposed to look like. I looked out the window quickly before tears could form. Some compliments still feel too heavy to carry. When we arrived at the Grand Meridian Hotel again, memories rushed through me so sharply that I almost stopped walking. Same marble entrance, same glowing chandeliers, same ballroom. 1 year earlier, I had entered that building feeling invisible. tonight felt different. Not because people suddenly respected me, because I respected myself enough not to shrink anymore. Michael stepped around the car and offered me his arm. Proudly, publicly, no hesitation. The gesture nearly broke my heart. As we entered the ballroom together, conversation softened around us. But this time, nobody stared with mockery. Many guests smiled warmly instead. Some even approached to shake my hand. A few older women quietly thanked me for the speech Charles gave last year after I left. Apparently, the phrase "a person's value is never stitched into a price tag" had spread throughout the company faster than I realized. Funny how truth travels once people finally hear it. Near the ballroom entrance, Charles Whitmore spotted us immediately. His entire face lit up. "There she is," he announced warmly. Before I could react, he crossed the room and hugged me again. But this time, the embrace felt calmer, like family reconnecting instead of history colliding. "You kept the dress?" he said with a smile. "Of course." He stepped back slightly to admire it. "Well," he laughed softly, "it's officially the most famous dress in Texas now." I covered my face briefly, embarrassed. "Please don't say that." But Charles looked serious again quickly. "You know how many letters the foundation received after last year?" I blinked. "Hundreds," he continued. "Women writing about divorce, widowhood, bankruptcy, starting over in their 60s. His eyes softened. "You made people feel seen." Emotions swelled painfully in my chest. Because all my life, I had thought survival was ordinary. But maybe survival becomes powerful when someone else feels less alone because of it. Music drifted softly through the ballroom while guests continued arriving around us. Then I noticed Vanessa standing near one of the tables across the room. For a brief moment, our eyes met. She looked different, still elegant, still polished, but quieter somehow, less sharp around the edges. She walked toward us slowly. I could feel Michael tense slightly beside me, not out of fear, protectiveness. Vanessa stopped a few feet away. "You look lovely tonight, Abigail," she said softly. The sincerity surprised me. "Thank you." An awkward silence followed. Then Vanessa glanced down briefly before speaking again. "I volunteer twice a month now at the Women's Transitional Housing Center." I blinked in surprise. "That's wonderful." She nodded quietly. It took me a long time to understand how cruel I had become. Her honesty felt real now. Not defensive like before, humbled. Pain often humbles people if they allow it to. Vanessa looked toward the ballroom crowd. "There are women there who remind me of the way I treated you." Her voice tightened slightly. "And honestly, it makes me sick sometimes." I studied her carefully. For the first time since meeting her, I saw vulnerability instead of performance. Not perfection. Humanity. "That feeling is called growth," I said gently. Tears filled her eyes immediately. She nodded once before quietly excusing herself. Michael watched her walk away silently. Then he looked at me. "You really forgave her." I smiled sadly. "Forgiveness and trust are different things." He laughed softly under his breath. "Yeah," he admitted. "I learned that this year too." A few moments later, Charles stepped onto the ballroom stage. The room quieted immediately. He smiled warmly toward me before beginning his speech. "1 year ago, he said something important happened in this ballroom." Guests listened carefully. Many people arrived believing success was measured by wealth, image, status, and appearance. His eyes moved slowly across the crowd. But one woman reminded us that dignity cannot be purchased. The room fell silent. Charles continued, "Tonight, Whitmore Capital is proud to officially launch a national scholarship initiative supporting women over 55 who are rebuilding their lives after hardship. Applause erupted instantly. Then Charles smiled directly at me. "We are honored to name it the Abigail Hernandez Foundation." My breath caught completely. The ballroom stood in applause again, but this time tears filled my eyes for an entirely different reason. Not humiliation. Healing. Michael squeezed my hand tightly beside me, and in that moment, I realized something beautiful. The greatest justice in life is not watching cruel people fall. It is refusing to let cruelty change who you are. I looked down at my old navy dress one final time, the dress that once made people laugh. Now it had become something else entirely. Proof. Proof that dignity survives humiliation. Proof that kindness outlives wealth. Proof that even an $18 dress can carry extraordinary grace when worn by someone who never allowed the world to harden her heart. Ket thuk fan moilam. After everything that happened, I've learned something important. Life will always place people in front of you who judge worth by money, appearance, status, or success. Some people will treat kindness as weakness. Others will only respect those who seem powerful. But real character reveals itself in the quiet moments in how we treat people who cannot benefit us, impress us, or elevate our image. For many years, I believed sacrifice meant staying silent no matter how badly I was treated. I thought love required enduring humiliation peacefully. But I finally understood that dignity matters too. You can be kind without allowing yourself to be diminished. You can forgive without forgetting your value. And sometimes the people we love most hurt us not because they are evil, but because they slowly lose sight of what truly matters. Pride, ambition, and insecurity can quietly reshape a person if they stop protecting their heart. What matters most is whether they are willing to change once truth finally reaches them. Michael changed because he chose humility over ego. Vanessa changed because shame forced her to confront herself honestly. And I changed because I stopped apologizing for surviving. If you are watching this today while struggling financially, emotionally, or personally, please remember this. Your value has never depended on the price tag attached to your clothes, your house, your career, or your bank account. Dignity comes from the way you love, sacrifice, endure, and continue showing kindness in a world that often forgets how important kindness truly is. If this story touched your heart, please like and subscribe to the channel. And I'd truly love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever been judged unfairly because of money, appearance, or where you came from? And tell me where you're watching from and what time it is in your city right now. Your stories mean more than you know.